Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange, often twisted origins of the monsters that lurk in Greek mythology. Now, you might think the gods would be busy sipping ambrosia and causing chaos in their divine ways. But no, they also had a knack for creating creatures that were downright terrifying. Some monsters were born of punishment, others of necessity, and a few just seemed to show up because, well, the gods were bored. Trust me, you probably won't survive this journey. Metaphorically speaking, of course. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I'm always curious about that. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The birth of monsters in Greek mythology is a peculiar thing. It wasn't like the gods just woke up one day and decided to summon a horde of creatures for fun, though if they did, that would make a great reality show. No. These beings came into existence through a mix of divine power, struggles, punishment, and necessity. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, or more accurately, their infinite boredom, created monsters to either serve as tests for heroes or to act as reminders of their strength. You see, in the world of Greek mythology, nothing is quite as it seems, and monsters are no exception. It all started with the first experiments in divine power, the Titans. These mighty beings were often seen as the precursors to the gods, the firstborn of the universe. But not all of them were content with their position in the cosmic hierarchy. One, particularly rebellious Titan Uranus, was overthrown by his own son Cronus, who chopped off Uranus's genitals and tossed them into the sea, because why not, right? From this chaotic act, a myriad of strange creatures began to take shape in the aftermath. But it wasn't just the gods causing chaos for the sake of it. Sometimes the creatures that emerged were meant to balance the scales of divine justice. For example, the Cyclopes were born from Uranus's spilled blood, created not out of malice, but to serve the gods' purposes. These one-eyed giants were skilled craftsmen and created weapons of incredible power, such as the thunderbolts that Zeus would eventually use to assert his dominance over the heavens. Historians still argue whether these monsters were meant to be symbolic of the forces of nature or representations of divine will. But no matter the intention, these creatures became central to the gods' world tools of war, instruments of punishment, or just unsettling forces that lingered in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. As we begin this journey through the world of Greek monsters, it's important to remember that they were not mere mindless beasts. Every one of them had a purpose, a lesson to impart, or a reason for being. And while many of these creatures were defeated by our favorite heroes, they all left their mark on the myths that would shape Western culture for millennia to come. Now that we've got the monsters brewing, let's dive into some of the more famous ones. It's hard to talk about Greek mythology without mentioning the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants who seem to get mixed up in everything from crafting powerful weapons to getting themselves involved in some pretty epic godly battles. You see, these creatures weren't just big and scary. They were also among the most talented artisans in the ancient world. They were like the Greek version of highly skilled factory workers, but with far more muscle and far fewer health regulations. The Cyclopes came from the union of Uranus and Gaia, which already sounds like the setup to a divine disaster. While Uranus was tossing all sorts of chaos into the universe, Gaia, the Earth herself, started giving birth to all kinds of creatures, and the Cyclopes were some of the most notable. With only one eye in the middle of their foreheads, they were both terrifying, and to be honest, a little funny looking, like someone had taken the worst possible design features from a giant, and thought, yeah, this'll work. But they were far from laughable when it came to their talents. The Cyclopes became known for their incredible skill in forging weapons, particularly for the gods. According to the myth, when Zeus needed a weapon to take down his father Cronus, it was the Cyclopes who forged the thunderbolts that Zeus would use in his mighty battles. These bolts weren't your typical garden variety lightning. They were weapons of destruction, capable of toppling gods' titans, and anything else that dared to oppose them. Imagine getting a custom-made weapon that could wipe out entire cities. Pretty solid customer service, right? Historians still debate whether the Cyclopes were purely symbolic creations, representing raw, untamed power, or whether their one-eyed appearance reflected the ancient Greek fascination with seeing things as they are without any distractions. Whatever the reason, they certainly left a lasting impression on the mythology. But like most of the creatures in Greek myths, the Cyclopes weren't exactly the type to get along with everyone. After they helped Zeus, they were cast aside and ultimately imprisoned. Their fate wasn't much different from other mythical monsters used and discarded when their usefulness had run out. The gods, in all their divine wisdom, never seemed to have much use for the creatures they created once their wars were over. As you're drifting off, just imagine the Cyclopes busy at work, hammering out lightning bolts under the weight of the sky. It's almost peaceful in its way, right? A giant workshop in the heavens where gods come to get the tools of destruction. But it wasn't long before these massive beings would find themselves trapped in the very myths they helped create forgotten, until heroes like Odysseus came along to show just how easily you could outwit the creatures who were once thought unbeatable. Now that we've got the monsters brewing, let's dive into some of the more famous ones. It's hard to talk about Greek mythology without mentioning the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants, who seem to get mixed up in everything from crafting powerful weapons to getting themselves involved in some pretty epic godly battles. You see, these creatures weren't just big and scary. They were also among the most talented artisans in the ancient world. They were like the Greek version of highly skilled factory workers, but with far more muscle and far fewer health regulations. The Cyclopes came from the union of Uranus and Gaia, which already sounds like the setup to a divine disaster. While Uranus was tossing all sorts of chaos into the universe, Gaia, the Earth herself, started giving birth to all kinds of creatures, and the Cyclopes were some of the most notable. With only one eye in the middle of their foreheads, they were both terrifying, and, to be honest, a little funny looking, like someone had taken the worst possible design features from a giant, and thought, yeah, this'll work. But they were far from laughable when it came to their talents. The Cyclopes became known for their incredible skill in forging weapons, particularly for the gods. According to the myth, when Zeus needed a weapon to take down his father Cronus, it was the Cyclopes who forged the thunderbolts that Zeus would use in his mighty battles. These bolts weren't your typical garden variety lightning. They were weapons of destruction, capable of toppling gods, titans, and anything else that dared to oppose them. Imagine getting a custom-made weapon that could wipe out entire cities. Pretty solid customer service, right? Historians still debate whether the Cyclopes were purely symbolic creations, representing raw, untamed power, or whether their one-eyed appearance reflected the ancient Greek fascination with seeing things as they are without any distractions. Whatever the reason, they certainly left a lasting impression on the mythology. But like most of the creatures in Greek myths, the Cyclopes weren't exactly the type to get along with everyone. After they helped Zeus, they were cast aside and, ultimately, imprisoned. Their fate wasn't much different from other mythical monsters, used and discarded when their usefulness had run out. The gods, in all their divine wisdom, never seemed to have much use for the creatures they created once their wars were over. As you're drifting off, just imagine the Cyclopes busy at work, hammering out lightning bolts under the weight of the sky. It's almost peaceful in its way, right? A giant workshop in the heavens, where gods come to get the tools of destruction. But it wasn't long before these massive beings would find themselves trapped in the very myths they helped create forgotten, until heroes like Odysseus came along to show just how easily you could outwit the creatures who were once thought unbeatable. Next up on our list of Greek monstrosities is one that needs little introduction, but certainly deserves a deeper dive: Medusa. Ah, Medusa. The name alone conjures up images of snakes for hair, and a gaze that could turn anyone to stone with just one look. But what many people don't realize is that Medusa wasn't always this terrifying stone-cold creature. In fact, she started out as a beautiful mortal woman, caught in a tale of divine punishment and transformation. That's as tragic as it is creepy. Medusa was once one of the most stunning women in ancient Greece, so beautiful that even Poseidon, yes, the god of the sea himself, couldn't resist her charms. The two were said to have a passionate affair in the temple of Athena, which, as you can imagine, didn't exactly sit well with the goddess. Athena, ever the vigilant protector of her sacred space, was furious. In a classic example of divine overreaction, honestly, these gods had issues. She punished Medusa by turning her beautiful hair into a nest of writhing snakes, and her once beautiful face into something so hideous that anyone who looked at her would turn to stone. Historians still argue whether Medusa's transformation was a way to punish a victim of sexual assault, or if it was merely a tool to show how divine jealousy and power could destroy lives. Either way, Medusa was left to live in isolation, cursed and feared by all. The poor woman, once admired for her beauty, became a symbol of the dangers of attraction and the consequences of divine wrath. Medusa's story takes a dramatic turn when the hero Perseus enters the scene. Armed with gifts from the gods, a shiny shield from Athena, winged sandals from Hermes, and a sword from Hephaestus Perseus, is tasked with killing Medusa and bringing back her head. Now, here's where things get a little interesting. Rather than looking Medusa directly in the eye and risking becoming a human statue, Perseus uses the reflection in his shield to track her down. He sneaks up on her, does the deed, and is off to the races with her head in tow. But here's the kicker. Medusa's death isn't just a victory for Perseus. It's a reminder of the ancient Greek idea of beauty and power. Medusa, after all, was a woman whose very existence was transformed by the wrath of gods who saw beauty and desire as something to be feared. She's become a symbol of both victimhood and danger, a paradoxical monster who once represented both innocence and punishment. As for the aftermath of her death, things get even weirder. From her blood, yes, the blood from her severed head, sprang the hero, Perseus's steed Pegasus, as well as Chrysaor the giant. It's as though the gods decided that even after death, Medusa's essence was too potent to be wasted. her monstrous legacy lived on in the most unexpected ways, and her image continued to haunt the ancient world. Historians still debate the exact cultural significance of Medusa's myth. Was she a symbol of the destructive power of unchecked desire? Was she the victim of a divine system that punished women for existing outside their prescribed roles? Either way, the legacy of Medusa is far from over, and the snake-haired monster remains one of the most iconic figures in Greek mythology. Now, let's take a little detour into one of the most famous, and if we're being honest, most confusing monsters in Greek mythology, the Minotaur. Picture this half-man, half-bull, all terrifying. The Minotaur didn't just exist as a random nightmare fuel for Greek heroes. He was central to one of the most famous labyrinthine tales in history. It's the kind of story where a lot of things don't really make sense, but somehow that's what makes it so enduring. The Minotaur's origin is steeped in royal drama. King Minos of Crete, a ruler known for being both powerful and, well, a little too proud, found himself at odds with the gods. It all began with a gift from Poseidon, a beautiful white bull which Minos was supposed to sacrifice in gratitude. But naturally, Minos decided to keep the bull for himself, thinking he could pull off a little divine deception. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with Poseidon. So, in a classic "be careful what you wish for" moment, Poseidon cursed Minos' wife Pasiphae to fall in love with the bull. And fall in love she did so much so that she asked a craftsman to build her a hollow wooden cow, which she then climbed into to, well, you can guess the rest. The result, a monster, a half-human, half-bull creature, who would come to be known as the Minotaur. Historians still argue over the symbolic meaning of the Minotaur. Was he merely the product of divine punishment for a king's pride and deceit, or was he a representation of the chaotic forces of nature, a reminder of the primal and untamable powers of the earth? The labyrinth in which he was confined could also be seen as a metaphor for the labyrinth of human emotions, desires and fears, complex, winding, and impossible to navigate without facing great challenges. Once the Minotaur was born, King Minos didn't exactly have a parenting plan in mind. Instead, he confined the creature to a vast labyrinth designed by the brilliant inventor Daedalus. This labyrinth was no ordinary maze. It was so complex that once someone entered, they could never find their way out. And so, the Minotaur became a prisoner of this maze, doomed to live out his days hunting down anyone unfortunate enough to be sent into the labyrinth. And that's where the story really kicks into gear. The famous Athenian hero, Theseus, volunteers to face the Minotaur, and with the help of a ball of string, because apparently Daedalus couldn't come up with a more advanced escape method, manages to navigate the labyrinth and kill the creature. But here's where things get a little more philosophical. The Minotaur, while a terrifying figure, wasn't exactly a villain in the traditional sense. He was in a way a victim of circumstances born out of divine vengeance and locked away for something over which he had no control. The labyrinth was his prison, and while he was a monster in the physical sense, it's not too hard to see how his existence can be interpreted as a metaphor for the human condition. We're all, in a sense, trapped in our own labyrinths of thought, emotion, and conflict, only to be forced to confront the monsters we create in the process. So, while Theseus's victory over the Minotaur might seem like a classic tale of heroism, it's also a reminder that not every monster is entirely evil. Sometimes the true monsters lie within the maze we build for ourselves. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the more bizarre creatures in Greek mythology, the Chimera. When you think of a classic mythical monster, This one definitely fits the bill. Picture this: a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. No, it's not some weird fusion of animals at a petting zoo. It's the chimera, one of the most terrifying creatures to ever crawl, slither, or roar through ancient myths. The chimera's origins are as complex as its animalistic composition. It was said to be the offspring of Typhon and Echidna. Yes, the same Typhon, who was a literal storm giant, and Echidna, the mother of all monsters. So this creature was destined to be nothing short of chaos incarnate, with the lion's head capable of spewing fire, the goat's body capable of causing destruction, and the serpent's tail that could lash out with deadly precision. The chimera was the perfect embodiment of the untamed forces of nature. It wasn't just a creature to be feared. It was a creature that had the power to bring entire civilizations to their knees. But like most mythological monsters, the chimera wasn't just a force of mindless destruction. No, it was much more symbolic than that. In fact, historians still argue whether the chimera was meant to represent a natural disaster or a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. Its hybrid form, part lion, part goat, part serpent, could be seen as a reflection of humanity's tendency to mix different elements together and create something far more dangerous than originally intended. In other words, the chimera was a cautionary tale about the consequences of meddling with forces beyond your control. The creature's role in Greek mythology also reflects the Greek obsession with heroism and the battle against overwhelming odds. Enter Bellerophon, a hero who would ultimately find himself tasked with slaying this horrific beast. Bellerophon, unlike most heroes, didn't just rely on brute strength. He had a little help from the gods in the form of Pegasus, the winged horse born from the blood of Medusa's severed neck. With Pegasus by his side, Bellerophon flew into battle against the chimera, using his superior speed and aerial advantage to strike the creature from above, eventually killing it with a spear. Now, the chimera's death doesn't just signify a victory for Bellerophon. It represents the idea of overcoming the impossible. After all, how could a man fight a beast that seemed to have all the power of nature itself? But by flying above it, Bellerophon was able to transcend the very limitations that the chimera embodied. It's almost like the myth itself was telling the ancient Greeks that sometimes the only way to overcome the chaos of the world is to rise above it literally and figuratively. Historians still debate whether the chimera's fiery, destructive nature was a direct allegory for the unpredictable nature of natural disasters, or whether it was more a reflection of the dangers of power unchecked by reason. After all, a creature with so many heads, each representing a different facet of chaos, was the perfect image of a world gone awry. And yet, in the end, it was defeated, not by brute force, but by the cleverness and skill of a hero who knew how to rise above it all. The chimera's death, like many mythological creatures, didn't just mark the end of its reign of terror. It also left behind a legacy. The story of Bellerophon's victory would be told for generations, reminding people that no matter how monstrous or overwhelming the forces of nature might seem, there was always hope for those who could rise above them. Now, let's travel to the depths of the underworld to meet a creature who guarded the gates of death itself, Cerberus, the three-headed dog. If you've ever heard of Cerberus, you know that this beast isn't your average run-of-the-mill guard dog. Oh no, this creature was large enough to block the entrance to the afterlife, with 3 fearsome heads and a tail that resembled a serpent. Basically, Cerberus was the bouncer of the underworld, and let me tell you, no one was getting past him without a serious fight. Cerberus was the offspring of Typhon and Echidna, because apparently, when these two decide to have kids, the resulting creatures are bound to be nightmares. This monstrous hound was given the important task of preventing the dead from escaping the underworld and ensuring that no one living could sneak in. He wasn't particularly friendly, and while he didn't exactly devour the souls of the dead like you might expect from a creature guarding a place of death, he sure didn't let anyone in without a fight. Historians still argue whether Cerberus represents the inevitability of death or if he's a symbol of the boundary between life and the afterlife. The 3 heads, of course, could represent the past, present, and future, as the dog sat between the living and the dead, always looking forward to the future, while the past and present were both contained in the realm of the underworld. Each head could also symbolize different aspects of death itself, one representing the physical death, the second the spiritual transition, and the third the eternal nature of the soul. It's an interesting, if somewhat eerie, concept. But Cerberus wasn't an entirely immovable force. There were instances in myth where he was either tricked or subdued by mortals, usually with some help from the gods. The most famous of these tales involves the hero Heracles or Hercules, depending on your preferred version, who was tasked with capturing Cerberus as one of his 12 labors. In this myth, Heracles had to enter the underworld, face off with the monstrous dog, and bring him back alive as proof of his strength. What's fascinating here is that Heracles didn't rely on force alone to subdue Cerberus. He used a combination of bravery skill and a bit of divine help. His ultimate success in capturing Cerberus alive without killing him, mind you, symbolizes the triumph of human determination over the inevitable forces of nature, like death itself. There's something almost comforting about this idea, isn't there? That despite the chaos and dangers of the world, humans have the will and the ability to confront even the most terrifying of creatures, whether they are physical beings like Cerberus or intangible concepts like death. But let's not forget the darker side of Cerberus's myth. The dog's role as the gatekeeper of the underworld also reminds us of the finality of death. It's as if Cerberus's constant vigilance over the underworld's gates tells us that death is a boundary that no one can cross back from, not even the bravest of heroes. As we move through the myths of Greek monsters, Cerberus stands out not just as a terrifying creature, but as a symbol of the limits of human power. He is the guardian of the boundary we all must face, the inevitable and inescapable end of our lives. As we continue our tour of terrifying creatures, let's focus on a group of creatures that were both mysterious and utterly wrathful: the Harpies. If you've never really understood why the Greeks were so obsessed with these winged furies, let me break it down for you. Harpies were part bird, part woman, and all trouble. They were creatures who personified the force of nature that could descend without warning, wreaking havoc in the lives of those unfortunate enough to cross their paths. The Harpies were daughters of Thaumas, a sea god, and Electra, one of the Oceanids, and they were known for their fearsome wings and their unsettling cries. Their role in Greek mythology was a little complicated. At one point, they were described as beautiful, seductive women, but over time they were transformed into terrifying, ugly creatures, with the heads of women and the bodies of birds. These creatures weren't just aggressive for the sake of it. they were agents of punishment. Whenever someone pissed off the gods, the harpies would swoop in, steal food or valuables, and generally cause mayhem. In some versions of their story, they would even torment their victims, taking away their ability to eat and leaving them starving and helpless. But like most monsters, the harpies weren't just mindless tormentors. Historians still debate whether they were meant to symbolize the destructive forces of nature, like hurricanes or storms that could come crashing down at any moment without warning. The way the harpies would swoop in and snatch things away from people, leaving them with nothing, could certainly be seen as a metaphor for the unpredictable nature of life's challenges, ones that come out of nowhere and leave you in a state of helplessness. There's also an argument to be made that the harpies served as a representation of moral retribution. The ancient Greeks had a deep belief in justice, divine cosmic justice, and the harpies were often sent by the gods to deliver punishment. In some myths, they were sent after people who had committed grave wrongs, stealing their food and harassing them until their suffering was complete. If you were one of those unlucky souls, it didn't matter how fast you ran or how high you climbed, the harpies would always find you swoop down and make sure you paid for your sins. But perhaps the most famous tale involving the harpies is that of Phineas, a prophet cursed by the gods. Phineas was given the ability to foresee the future, but unfortunately, he abused this power, revealing secrets that angered the gods. As punishment, Zeus sent the harpies to torment him. Every time Phineas tried to eat, the harpies would swoop in and snatch his food away, leaving him perpetually hungry and powerless. Eventually, the Argonauts, led by Jason, came to Phineas's rescue. They chased the harpies away, and in the process, they helped Phineas regain his freedom and his ability to eat in peace. Even though the harpies were ultimately driven away, their image stayed with the Greeks for centuries as a reminder of the uncontrollable destructive forces that could suddenly appear in life. While they might have been a symbol of divine retribution, they were also a reminder of the relentless unpredictability of nature and the consequences of crossing the gods. After all, it's never a good idea to anger the powerful forces at work in the universe. Historians still argue whether the transformation of the harpies from seductive women to terrifying monsters was symbolic of the shift in Greek views on women, especially women who were seen as dangerous or disruptive. Were the harpies a reflection of the fear of female power, or simply a symbol of natural chaos? It's hard to say for sure, but one thing is clear: they were not to be trifled with. Next up on our list of legendary monsters is one that combines the beauty of music with the deadly consequences of temptation: the sirens. Ah, yes, the sirens, those irresistible creatures whose songs lured sailors to their doom. You've probably heard of them, those enchanting beings whose melodic voices could charm even the most steadfast men, leading them to crash their ships upon jagged rocks. But while the sirens are often romanticized as nothing more than femme fatales of the sea, their story carries much deeper, darker meanings. The sirens were said to be daughters of the river god Achelous, and a muse which already sets the stage for their captivating abilities. With their bird-like bodies and beautiful women's faces, the sirens embodied both the allure of the feminine and the dangers of nature itself. Their role in Greek mythology was clear. They sang to travelers, particularly sailors, with such beauty and sweetness that those who heard them couldn't resist steering their ships toward the source of the music. And of course, it was a fatal mistake. The rocks near the Sirens' Island were treacherous, and once a shipwreck occurred, the sirens would feast on the wrecked sailors' bodies. But let's dig a little deeper. Historians still argue whether the sirens represent the danger of unchecked desire or the destructive power of beauty. After all, the sirens weren't malicious in the traditional sense. They didn't actively chase down the sailors. They merely sang, inviting those who were foolish enough to listen. The fatal allure of the siren's song is symbolic of the dangers of temptation. It's a reminder that while beauty and pleasure are alluring, they often come with hidden consequences that can lead to ruin. Perhaps the most famous encounter with the sirens happens in Homer's Odyssey, when the hero Odysseus and his crew sail past their island. Forewarned by the sorceress, Circe Odysseus orders his men to block their ears with beeswax so they can't hear the sirens' enchanting song. As they approach the island, Odysseus himself, curious to hear their music, has himself tied to the mast of his ship, instructing his crew to sail on no matter how much he begs to be freed. His cleverness allowed him to survive the sirens' trap, though not without considerable danger. But why the sirens? What's their true purpose in the grand scheme of Greek mythology? Some historians suggest they symbolize the unpredictability of human desires. At its core, their song represents the seduction of easy pleasure, something that can be irresistible to a man or anyone who hasn't learned the strength to resist. Others argue that the sirens also represent the isolation and alienation of life on the sea, a reminder of the dangers of being too far removed from civilization and society. While Odysseus was clever enough to resist, many sailors before him weren't so lucky. The sirens may have been one of the few monsters that didn't require brute force to defeat. Rather, it was about resisting temptation and knowing when to walk away. Maybe that's the real moral of the story, that sometimes the biggest dangers aren't the ones that chase you down. They're the ones that whisper softly in your ear, convincing you to follow them. In a way, the sirens serve as a reflection of how easily humans can be led astray by desire, and how careful we must be not to lose sight of our path. But of course, if we're being honest with ourselves, it's hard not to be at least a little curious about what those songs might sound like. Let's shift gears for a moment and explore one of the more chilling aspects of Greek mythology, the Gorgons. When you hear Gorgon, the first name that probably comes to mind is Medusa, and for good reason, considering she's the most famous of them all. But what many people don't realize is that Medusa wasn't the only Gorgon. In fact, the Gorgons were a trio of sisters, all cursed with the same terrible powers, and all possessing a gaze that could turn anyone to stone. It's a good thing they weren't around today. Imagine how many innocent selfies would end up petrified. The Gorgons, Medusa. Stheno and Euryale were daughters of the ancient sea deities, Phorcys and Ceto. Unlike Medusa, who is often depicted as a tragic figure in the myths, her sisters were said to have been monstrous from birth. Their appearances were terrifying writhing snakes, for hair-sharp fangs, and a gaze so powerful that it could freeze anyone who dared to look into their eyes. If you were unlucky enough to meet a Gorgon face to face, well, let's just say you'd be taking a one-way trip to the realm of stone statues. As with many mythological creatures, there's more to the Gorgons than just their horrifying appearance. The question arises, what do they represent? Historians still argue whether the Gorgons were a symbol of fear itself or something more, maybe even a reflection of how monstrous powers could be used as a form of punishment or protection. After all, the Gorgons weren't the only ones with dangerous powers. The gods themselves, with their ability to create or destroy life, often had creatures like the Gorgons at their disposal as agents of divine retribution. And Medusa, with her transformation from beauty to monstrosity, could be seen as a symbol of the consequences of divine anger or vengeance, especially considering the fact that she was once a mortal woman who was punished for the crime of being too beautiful. In the case of Medusa, her story is tragic on multiple levels. She didn't choose to become a monster. She was cursed by Athena after being violated by Poseidon in Athena's temple. While many see Medusa's transformation as a punishment for her beauty and her affair with Poseidon, others view her as a victim of the gods' cruelty. Regardless of her backstory, Medusa became the face of the Gorgon myth, overshadowing her sisters Stheno and Euryale, whose fates remain somewhat obscure. Medusa's death at the hands of Perseus is one of the most iconic moments in Greek mythology. Armed with a reflective shield from Athena, a sword from Hephaestus, and winged sandals from Hermes Perseus, set out to decapitate Medusa. And while the moment of her death might seem like a triumph of heroism, it's also steeped in irony. Medusa's severed head still had the power to turn people to stone, and in some myths, Perseus used it to turn his enemies to stone, essentially making Medusa's deadly gift an instrument of power even after her death. Some historians believe that Medusa's head, and by extension the Gorgon myth, symbolized the fear and power that came with the female gaze, something that in Greek society could be viewed as dangerous, even if it was used as a form of protection. The idea that the Gorgon's gaze could petrify those who dared to look at them suggests a profound fear of female power and beauty, one that could transform into something terrifying if not contained. But it wasn't just Medusa who was feared. Her sisters, though less frequently mentioned, were just as dangerous. Stheno, the eldest sister, was said to be the most vengeful and merciless, while Euryale's screams were so loud they could shatter glass. Together, the three Gorgons formed an unstoppable force, one that in many ways reflected the terrifying consequences of divine punishment and the unpredictable power of vengeance. In the end, the myth of the Gorgons reminds us that monsters in Greek mythology weren't just creations of horror, they were also deeply symbolic. Whether as symbols of fear, punishment, or the corrupting effects of unchecked beauty and power, the Gorgons remain some of the most enduring figures in ancient myth. Let's keep things moving as we head toward another one of those legendary beasts that have haunted the Greek imagination for centuries, the Sphinx. Ah, yes, the Sphinx, half lion, half woman, and all riddle. If Medusa was the victim of divine wrath, the Sphinx was something altogether different. She wasn't a creation of the gods, as much as she was a force of nature, an embodiment of mystery and judgment, wrapped in one terrifying form. The Sphinx was said to have come from the lands of Egypt, although Greek mythology adopted her and gave her a more ominous role. She was known to sit outside the city of Thebes, blocking the gates and terrorizing the people. The Sphinx was a riddle maker. She would challenge travelers to answer her riddles, and those who failed to answer correctly met a grim fate. She would devour them. There was no mercy, no room for error. Solve her riddle or perish. And while the Sphinx's form was indeed monstrous, it was her intellect that made her truly terrifying. Historians still debate the meaning behind the Sphinx's riddle, which goes like this: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? The answer, of course, is a human. A baby crawls on all 4s, An adult walks on the 2 legs, and the elderly often use a cane, thus walking on 3. But while the riddle seems simple enough, it's actually a profound reflection on the human condition. The Sphinx wasn't just challenging people's knowledge. She was challenging their understanding of life itself. The riddle touches on the stages of life, youth, adulthood, and old age, and forces the listener to consider the fleeting nature of human existence. Solve it, and you show that you understand your place in the world. Fail, and you face the consequences. But there's more to the Sphinx than just her riddles. The fact that she was a creature of both feminine and animal power points to the ways in which Greek culture viewed the intersection of beauty, danger, and wisdom. The Sphinx could be seen as a representation of the unknowable aspects of life, a creature whose riddle is impossible to answer without first confronting the inevitable, our mortality. The ancient Greeks were no strangers to the idea that life is full of challenges, many of which seem insurmountable. But the Sphinx's myth is a reminder that while the answers to life's big questions may seem elusive, solving them requires both intellect and courage. The most famous encounter with the Sphinx comes from the myth of Oedipus, the tragic hero who, without fully knowing it, was destined to fulfill the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus was passing through Thebes when he encountered the Sphinx, who posed her infamous riddle. Unlike the many who failed before him, Oedipus answered correctly, and as a result, he freed the city from the monster's grasp. The Sphinx, realizing she had been outwitted, threw herself from a cliff and died. Oedipus, victorious in solving the riddle, became the hero of Thebes. But, as is often the case in Greek mythology, victory is short-lived. His fate, already sealed by prophecy, would soon unfold in the most tragic way possible. Historians continue to explore the deeper significance of the Sphinx. Some suggest that her riddles are a metaphor for the challenges of life that we must all face, and that the true victory is not just in solving them, but in how we confront them. The Sphinx's defeat at the hands of Oedipus is as much a reflection of the hero's intelligence as it is of his tragic flaw, his inability to truly know himself and his destiny. It's a reminder that while intellect and cunning can help you overcome obstacles, they don't always shield you from the consequences of fate. The Sphinx, with her mix of terror and wisdom, represents a critical intersection of power, mystery, and judgment. She is not merely a monster to be defeated, but a symbol of the constant, unanswerable questions that life throws at us. And as with many of the creatures in Greek mythology, the lesson of the Sphinx isn't just about triumph. It's about understanding the limits of our knowledge and the consequences of trying to outwit the mysteries of the world. Now, let's step back for a moment and revisit a creature that might not be as well known as the others, but certainly deserves a place in the pantheon of terrifying Greek monsters, the Titans. The Titans are the ancient gods who preceded the Olympians, essentially the first generation of powerful deities who ruled the cosmos before Zeus and his siblings took the throne. If the gods are the rock stars of Greek mythology, the Titans were the original legends. And just like rock stars, some of the Titans weren't content with merely ruling. They wanted to create chaos, challenge the heavens, and naturally stir up trouble with their offspring. The Titans were born from Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky, and their reign was marked by immense power and, unfortunately, a whole lot of violence. Uranus, in particular, wasn't the best father figure, he feared the power of his children, and imprisoned many of them in the depths of the earth. This angered Gaia, who in turn convinced her son Cronus to overthrow Uranus. Cronus, driven by ambition and perhaps a little bit of daddy issues, castrated Uranus, thus beginning the reign of the Titans. But here's where things get really interesting. Historians still debate whether the Titans were meant to represent the primal, untamable forces of nature, or whether they were symbolic of a bygone era that needed to be overthrown. Were they just the rough and tumble forebears of the gods, or were they representations of the chaotic and destructive powers of the natural world that had to be subdued for civilization to flourish? Either way, the Titans' reign didn't last long. As time went on, Zeus and his siblings, born of Cronus and Rhea, decided they were ready to take over the world. The result was the Titanomachy, the epic battle between the Titans and the Olympian gods, where the fate of the world was up for grabs. It wasn't just a simple clash of good versus evil. It was more of a cosmic power struggle that involved everything from fierce combat to divine intervention. Zeus, with his thunderbolts, led the charge against the Titans, and in the end, the Olympians were victorious. But what became of the defeated Titans? In typical Greek fashion, they weren't simply killed off. Instead, the Titans who fought against the Olympians were cast into the deepest, most desolate pit of the underworld Tartarus. There, they were left to suffer for eternity, a grim reminder that no one, no matter how mighty, is immune from the consequences of challenging the established order. But not all the Titans were banished. Some, like Oceanus and Hyperion, managed to stay on the sidelines during the battle, or were spared by Zeus. It's interesting how in some cases the Titans were allowed to live out their existence, while others were punished. This raises the question: were some forces in nature destined to be subdued, while others had to remain unchallenged forever? The battle between the Titans and the Olympians is more than just a myth. It's an allegory for the constant tension between the old and the new, the past and the future, and the forces of nature that must be controlled. While the Olympians are often viewed as the good guys in this story, there's an undeniable sense of loss and tragedy in the fall of the Titans. They were the first gods after all. Their defeat marked the end of an era, and while it paved the way for a new order, it also left behind remnants of power that would never quite be the same again. In the end, the Titans' fall is a reminder that no matter how powerful a being or force may be, the balance of the world will always shift, and new powers will rise to challenge the old. It's a cyclical theme in Greek mythology. The old gods fall only to be replaced by new ones who will one day meet the same fate. The Titans, once rulers of all, are now relegated to the shadows of mythology, their legacy etched into the myths of the gods who succeeded them. Let's move on to another pair of mythical creatures that have become legends in their own right, Scylla and Charybdis. These two monstrous beings are often remembered for the terrifying strait between them, a dangerous passage that no sailor dared to cross without facing certain peril. The myth of Scylla and Charybdis embodies the very essence of the between a rock and a hard place situation, where no matter what you do, it feels like you're bound to meet a tragic end. But in this myth, there's more to the creatures than just their monstrous appearances. They represent the endless tension between opposing forces with no easy way out. Scylla, the more famous of the two, was once a beautiful nymph. But as with so many of the other tragic figures in Greek mythology, her story took a dark turn. The sea god Glaucus fell in love with her, but when she rejected his advances, he sought help from the sorceress Circe. Instead of helping him win her love, Circe became jealous and in a fit of rage transformed Scylla into a hideous creature. Scylla's once beautiful body was now a grotesque blend of human and monstrous features. 12 legs, 6 heads each, with 3 rows of sharp teeth. From her hideous form, she would attack ships, devouring sailors unfortunate enough to pass by. Charybdis, on the other hand, was a massive sea monster that lived beneath the waters, creating whirlpools so powerful that they could swallow entire ships whole. Unlike Scylla, Charybdis didn't actively hunt down sailors. She simply existed as a force of nature, drawing everything into her maelstrom of destruction. Together, Scylla and Charybdis formed a kind of nightmare duo, with one threatening from above and the other from below. Historians still debate the symbolism behind these two creatures. Were they representative of natural disasters like whirlpools and storms, or were they simply metaphors for the dangers and dilemmas that people face in life? The situation that sailors found themselves in, trapped between Scylla and Charybdis, forced to choose between two equally dangerous paths, can be seen as a metaphor for the difficult choices we face in life, where every decision leads to some form of loss or danger. Perhaps the most famous example of someone facing this terrifying pair comes from Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus, on his long journey home from the Trojan War, was forced to navigate this perilous passage. Forewarned by the sorceress, Circe, Odysseus chose to sail closer to Scylla, knowing that while he would lose some of his men, the alternative, sailing too close to Charybdis, could mean losing his entire ship. It was a terrible decision, but it was the one that minimized the loss. And yet, even as Odysseus made the best of a bad situation, the gods seemed to have a way of making sure that no matter what path he took, suffering was inevitable. The myth of Scylla and Charybdis taps into the very human experience of being caught between two equally disastrous options. It's a reminder that sometimes life offers us no easy way out. No matter how carefully we navigate, there will always be risks, and sometimes the best we can do is minimize the damage. But perhaps it's also a reflection of the idea that no one can escape the natural forces of the world. These monsters, born from the depths of the sea, are symbols of the uncontrollable and unpredictable forces in life that we must all face, whether we like it or not. In the end, the myth of Scylla and Charybdis isn't just about navigating dangerous waters. It's about the choices we make when there are no good choices left. It's a story that resonates with anyone who has ever been stuck between two undesirable paths, knowing that no matter which one they choose, the journey will still be fraught with danger. The only thing left to do is move forward, take the loss, and try to survive the best way we can. Let's turn now to one of the larger-than-life characters of Greek mythology, Antaeus the giant, who could never be defeated as long as he remained on solid ground. Imagine a monster so powerful that the earth itself was his greatest ally, a giant who could not be stopped unless someone found a way to take away his connection to the very thing that made him invincible. Antaeus was the son of Gaia, the earth, and Poseidon, the sea god, which meant that his strength was tied directly to the ground beneath his feet. As long as he stood on the earth, he was an unstoppable force, able to challenge and defeat anyone who dared to cross his path. Antaeus was known for his fearsome power, which he used to challenge all who came near his home in Libya. He would wrestle with his victims and, using his immense strength, crush them to death. He wasn't just a brute. Antaeus was a strategic fighter, using his intimate connection to the earth to recharge and regain his strength every time he was thrown to the ground. For him, the earth wasn't just a surface. It was a source of life and vitality, allowing him to fight with renewed strength each time he touched it. But as with many of the great monsters in Greek mythology, Antaeus's strength wasn't enough to prevent his downfall. The hero Heracles, in his quest to complete the 12 labors, encountered Antaeus and accepted the challenge to wrestle him. Heracles, however, quickly realized that he couldn't defeat the giant by simply using brute strength. He needed a strategy. Recognizing that Antaeus's strength was tied to the earth, Heracles lifted the giant off the ground, taking away his connection to Gaia and rendering him powerless. Once Antaeus was no longer able to draw power from the earth, Heracles was able to defeat him, ending his reign of terror. Historians still debate whether Antaeus's connection to the earth represents a form of invulnerability or a deeper symbol of the natural forces that are beyond human control. Was Antaeus merely a reminder of the unstoppable power of the natural world? Or was his defeat by Heracles a symbolic commentary on the limitations of physical strength when faced with a strategic and clever mind? Some scholars believe that Antaeus's fall shows that while nature is powerful, even the greatest forces can be overcome with the right approach. The story of Antaeus is also one of hubris and balance. His immense strength drawn from his bond with the earth made him overconfident and led him to believe he was invincible. But it was precisely his over-reliance on that strength that led to his downfall. Heracles, using not just his physical power, but also his intellect, showed that even the most powerful forces of nature can be outmaneuvered if you know where to strike. In that sense, Antaeus's defeat is a story of how raw power without wisdom or balance can lead to destruction. Antaeus's legacy, like many of the monsters in Greek mythology, reminds us of the importance of understanding the forces we face. His connection to the earth was his greatest strength, but it was also his greatest weakness. The story serves as a reminder that no matter how invincible something may seem, there's always a way to find its vulnerability, whether it's physical or strategic. In the end, Antaeus's death at the hands of Heracles isn't just a victory for strength. It's a victory for the clever application of knowledge. A lesson that even the most formidable monsters in Greek mythology had their weaknesses. The earth might be the source of immense power, but it's also a force that can be disrupted, challenged, and ultimately overcome. Now, let's explore one of the more chaotic and destructive creatures in Greek mythology, Typhon, the storm giant. Typhon wasn't just a giant. He was the embodiment of all that is violent and uncontrollable in nature. Think of him as the original natural disaster, a monster whose very presence signaled catastrophic change. He was born of Gaia, like so many other monstrous beings, and Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, which already paints a picture of just how powerful and destructive he was destined to become. With a body covered in serpents and a head that could spit fire, Typhon was in many ways the ultimate expression of the forces of chaos. Typhon's appearance was so terrifying that the mere sight of him could send gods and mortals into a panic. He had 100 dragon heads that could breathe fire, a voice that could shatter mountains and a body that stretched across the horizon. If you can imagine the most destructive storm or natural disaster, one that tears apart everything in its path, that's Typhon. He was the ultimate force of nature, one that could not be reasoned with, only fled from or fought. The battle between Typhon and the Olympian gods is one of the most dramatic and powerful in Greek mythology. Typhon sought to overthrow Zeus and take control of the heavens, and in doing so, he challenged the very order of the universe. The gods, with their divine powers, were no match for his sheer size and destructive force. It took everything the gods had to resist Typhon's rage. However, after a fierce battle that saw even Zeus nearly defeated, it was the cunning of the gods that ultimately brought about Typhon's downfall. Zeus, with the help of his allies, was able to trap Typhon beneath Mount Etna, where he would continue to cause volcanic eruptions whenever he stirred in his prison. Historians still argue about what Typhon's defeat represents. Was he a symbol of the raw, untamable forces of nature, earthquakes, hurricanes, and volcanic eruptions? Or was he a representation of the destructive forces within human nature? Things like unchecked anger and greed that could tear apart the world if left unchecked. Some even view Typhon's defeat as a commentary on the inevitable rise and fall of powerful entities, suggesting that no matter how mighty a creature or god may be, there will always come a time when they are overthrown. Typhon's myth, however, is also a reminder of the delicate balance between order and chaos. The Olympians, who represented the structured, rational order of the cosmos, had to fight against the primal chaos that Typhon embodied. And while they ultimately triumphed, Typhon's power left a permanent mark on the world, as evidenced by the volcanic eruptions and natural disasters that were said to be caused by his movements beneath the earth. Even in defeat, Typhon continued to wreak havoc on the world, serving as a reminder of the dangers of chaos and disorder. The myth of Typhon speaks to something deeply primal in human nature, the fear of the uncontrollable of forces that can destroy everything in their path without warning or reason. But it also highlights the tension between the gods and the natural world. As powerful as the Olympians were, they had to fight with every ounce of their strength to maintain their control over the cosmos. Typhon's defeat, then, is not just a victory for Zeus, but a reminder of the constant struggle between order and chaos, and the price that must be paid to keep the forces of destruction at bay. In the end, Typhon's myth is one of cosmic struggle, a reminder of the volatile forces that shape the world both in nature and within ourselves. Even as the gods triumphed over him, Typhon's presence beneath the earth continued to symbolize the ever-present potential for chaos, something that no amount of order could ever completely eliminate. Now, let's take a look at a creature whose invincibility made it one of the most famous monsters in Greek mythology, the Nemean lion. This beast wasn't just terrifying because of its size or strength, it was immortal. That's right. No matter how many times you tried to kill it, its golden fur was impenetrable. It was a creature so formidable that even the gods themselves couldn't bring it down with a weapon. The Nemean lion was one of the first obstacles Heracles had to face in his 12 labors, and let me tell you, it wasn't an easy task. The Nemean lion lived in the region of Nemea, where it terrorized the local populace. With its immense size, razor-sharp claws, and invulnerable hide, the lion was more than just a terrifying predator. It It was a force of nature that seemed unbeatable. In many ways, the Nemean lion represented the idea of an unstoppable force in the world, something that could never be defeated, no matter how hard you tried. Its golden fur, impervious to all weapons, made it a nearly indestructible foe, one that challenged even the greatest of heroes. When Heracles was tasked with slaying the Nemean lion, he quickly realized that his usual methods of attack wouldn't work. No sword, no spear, no arrow could pierce the lion's hide. So, in a moment of desperation and insight, Heracles came up with a different plan. He would wrestle the lion. He trapped the beast inside its cave, and with his immense strength, he strangled it with his bare hands. It wasn't an easy victory. Heracles struggled against the lion's powerful claws and fangs, but in the end, he was able to overpower it, proving that even an invincible creature could be defeated with enough strength and determination. But the Nemean lion wasn't just a physical challenge, it was also a symbol. Historians still debate what the lion represents in Greek mythology. Some see it as a symbol of the strength and power of nature, something that could never be fully controlled. Others argue that the lion represents the untamable wild side of humanity, our primal instincts and desires that cannot be subdued by reason or logic alone. Whatever the case, the Nemean lion was more than just a beast. It was a challenge that tested Heracles' will and his ability to adapt to impossible situations. The victory over the Nemean lion had a profound impact on Heracles' journey. After defeating the beast, he took its pelt and wore it as armor, which became one of his most iconic symbols. The pelt's impenetrability symbolized Heracles' own invincibility and strength, and it served as a reminder of his ability to overcome even the greatest challenges. The Nemean lion, once a terrifying monster, became a part of his legend, a trophy of his victory over the impossible. But there's a deeper lesson in the story of the Nemean lion. Heracles' victory wasn't just about brute strength. It was about resourcefulness, perseverance, and adaptability. He couldn't defeat the lion with traditional weapons, so he had to think outside the box. His ability to wrestle the lion into submission showed that sometimes physical challenges require more than just raw power. They require ingenuity and determination. And it's this lesson that makes the Nemean lion such an enduring symbol in Greek mythology. The idea that even the most invincible challenges can be overcome with the right mindset. In the end, the Nemean lion is a reminder that no matter how difficult the obstacle may seem, there is always a way to overcome it. It's about understanding the nature of the challenge, adapting your approach, and not giving up even when victory seems impossible. Let's now focus on another fearsome creature of Greek mythology, the Caledonian boar. This was no ordinary wild boar. It was a creature of immense size and ferocity, capable of terrorizing entire regions with its insatiable hunger. The myth of the Caledonian boar is one of heroism, sacrifice, and the struggle between man and nature. But there's more to this beast than just its monstrous strength. It's tied to themes of vengeance, divine anger, and the hero's journey, making it a compelling part of Greek mythology. The boar was sent by Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, as a punishment to King Oeneus of Caledon. Oeneus had neglected to honor Artemis during his harvest sacrifice, an oversight that enraged the goddess. To teach him a lesson, she sent the gigantic boar to ravage the countryside, destroying crops and terrorizing the people. The creature was unlike any boar the people had ever seen. It was monstrous in size, with tusks capable of ripping through anything in its path. No one in Caledon could stand up to it, and its rampage seemed endless. Historians still debate the deeper significance of the boar's rampage. Some see the beast as a representation of the untamed forces of nature, powerful, unpredictable, and destructive when not properly respected. Others believe the boar's wrath symbolizes the consequences of failing to honor the divine, particularly the gods of the wild, and hunting like Artemis. Whatever the interpretation, the boar's destruction was seen as a direct result of human folly, a reminder that the gods were not to be trifled with. As the boar's terror grew, a group of heroes gathered to hunt it down. The most famous among them was Atalanta, the only woman in the group and one of the greatest hunters in all of Greece. Atalanta's role in the hunt is a standout moment. Her speed and skill with the bow allowed her to be the first to wound the boar, marking a significant moment for her as one of the few women to play such an important role in Greek heroic tales. It's clear that her inclusion was more than just a token gesture. Atalanta was a skilled hunter in her own right, and her actions during the hunt highlight her importance as a heroic figure in her own right. The hunt itself, which was filled with heroic struggle and sacrifice, culminates in the death of the boar. After Atalanta strikes the first blow, Meleager, the son of King Oeneus, delivers the fatal blow to the beast. But the victory came with consequences. Meleager's actions afterward led to a bitter dispute over the spoils of the hunt. He wanted to reward Atalanta for her skill, but his uncles disagreed and attempted to claim the boar's hide for themselves. In the ensuing conflict, Meleager killed his uncles in a fit of rage, an act that set off a chain of tragic events. Meleager's life ended soon after, and his death, like many in Greek mythology, was a direct consequence of his emotional impulses and rash actions. The Caledonian boar is in many ways a symbol of the dangers of unchecked anger, both divine and human. Artemis' anger brought about the boar's rampage, and Meleager's own anger led to his downfall. It's a cycle of vengeance and wrath that permeates many Greek myths, where the gods are quick to punish, and heroes are often brought low by their own flaws. But beyond the violence and tragic deaths, the hunt itself also symbolizes the bond between humans and nature. The heroes who gathered to hunt the boar were not just fighting an animal. They were fighting the very forces of nature and the consequences of failing to live in harmony with the gods. Atalanta's involvement in the hunt also challenges traditional gender roles in Greek mythology. Her bravery and skill made her an equal to the men around her, and she played a pivotal role in the defeat of the boar. Her presence in the hunt highlights how the mythological world occasionally broke from the norm to feature women as equal participants in heroic acts, despite the broader societal constraints placed on them. In the end, the death of the Caledonian boar wasn't just about the triumph of the hunters. It was a reminder of the precariousness of life in a world where divine favor could be as fleeting as human pride. The hunt, the struggle, and the eventual tragic outcome reflect the dangers of anger, vengeance, and the often complicated relationship between humans and the gods. Now, let's take a look at a creature whose reputation spread across the seas, terrorizing the island of Crete, the Cretan bull. Unlike some of the other monsters we've encountered so far, The Cretan bull wasn't a direct product of divine rage or punishment. It was more a symbol of power and pride. But as with most Greek myths, even creatures that begin as symbols of beauty or strength often spiral into chaos and tragedy. The Cretan bull was a magnificent creature sent by Poseidon to King Minos of Crete as a sign of divine favor. The bull was said to be so strong and beautiful that Minos, impressed by its splendor, decided to keep it for himself rather than sacrifice it to Poseidon as instructed. Now, this was a classic example of the Greek gods taking offense to being slighted. Poseidon, enraged by Minos' arrogance, cursed the bull, making it wild and uncontrollable. The bull's once noble nature was twisted into something monstrous, and it became a terror, rampaging across the island of Crete and causing chaos wherever it went. Historians still argue about the symbolism of the Cretan bull. Some see it as a representation of the consequences of defying the gods and thinking oneself above divine law. Minos' pride and decision to keep the bull for himself, rather than offering it to Poseidon, were seen as direct acts of hubris. The bull's transformation into a terrifying beast could be interpreted as a metaphor for the destructive consequences of human arrogance, as if the gods were sending a message: defy us, and you will pay the price. The bull's rampage became a legendary part of the myth of Heracles. In fact, capturing the Cretan bull was one of the 12 labors that Heracles was assigned. Heracles was tasked with bringing the bull back to Eurystheus, the king who had set the labors for him alive. The bull was a powerful creature, and even Heracles, with all his strength, had a hard time subduing it. After a fierce struggle, he was able to wrestle the bull into submission, symbolizing the victory of heroic strength over the chaos of nature. He brought it back to Eurystheus, but not before the bull's wild nature caused some problems along the way. The bull's wild energy didn't just stay confined to Crete. It spread across the land, even traveling as far as Marathon, where it caused further destruction before being captured. In many ways, the Cretan bull was a symbol of the uncontrollable forces of nature, wild, untamable, and capable of destruction if left unchecked. Its rampage mirrored the chaos that can arise when humans meddle with the natural order, defying divine will and thinking they can control the uncontrollable. But the bull wasn't just a force of nature. It was also a reminder of how even the most majestic creatures can be corrupted by human actions. The bull, once a symbol of divine beauty, became a symbol of human error, a cautionary tale of what happens when pride outweighs respect for the gods. Interestingly, the Cretan bull's legacy didn't end with Heracles. In later myths, it was said that the bull's bloodline continued to produce strong and powerful creatures, suggesting that despite its initial transformation into a beast, the bull's strength could never be fully contained. The story of the Cretan bull is also one of transformation, a creature that began as a gift from the gods, but was turned into a monster due to human pride. It's a myth that reinforces the theme of nature's wildness and the unpredictable consequences of human actions. As with many of the monsters in Greek mythology, the Cretan bull's story is more than just a tale of a hero's victory over a creature. It's a reminder of the complex relationship between humans and the natural world, the gods, and the forces that shape our lives. It challenges the idea of control and suggests that no matter how much we try to impose our will on nature, there are some forces like the Cretan bull that cannot be contained. Let's turn now to a tragic figure whose monstrous transformation is tied directly to the intense emotions of jealousy and rage, Lamia. The myth of Lamia is one that showcases the darker sides of the gods, especially the jealousy and vengeance of Hera, and it carries a heavy message about the consequences of divine wrath. Lamia wasn't always a monster. She started out as a beautiful queen of Libya, admired for her beauty, until she crossed paths with Zeus, the king of the gods. Lamia's tragedy began when she caught Zeus's eye. In typical Greek god fashion, Zeus had an affair with Lamia, and she became pregnant with his child. This, of course, did not sit well with Zeus's wife, Hera. In a fit of rage and jealousy, Hera cursed Lamia, turning her into a hideous, monstrous creature. But that wasn't all. Hera's punishment was far crueler. She killed all of Lamia's children, ensuring that the grief-stricken mother would be forever tormented by the loss of her children. To make matters worse, Lamia was also cursed with the inability to sleep, forcing her to remain in her monstrous form, driven mad by grief and longing. Historians still argue about the deeper symbolism behind Lamia's myth. Was she a symbol of the consequences of divine jealousy? Was her transformation into a monster a reflection of the extreme emotional pain that can transform even the most beautiful or innocent into something monstrous? Or was she a reflection of the dangers of love and desire in a world where the gods themselves can be both capricious and cruel? In some versions of the myth, Lamia's grief and transformation led her to a darker path. She became a child-eating monster, hunting down children to devour, as if her own twisted way of seeking revenge for the ones she had lost. Her very nature became a source of terror. The idea of a mother consuming the very children she had lost is a powerful and disturbing symbol. Lamia's monstrous form became the embodiment of both her sorrow and her rage, turning her into a creature that no longer resembled the woman she once was. Lamia's myth, though tragic, is also one of transformation. While many myths depict monsters as inherently evil or mindless, Lamia is a tragic figure who became monstrous through her suffering. In her case, her transformation was not a simple act of divine malice. It was a result of her emotions being taken to their most extreme. The grief of losing her children and the jealousy of Hera combined to create a creature that could no longer recognize herself. She became something much darker, trapped by the very emotions that had once made her human. The myth of Lamia also serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of unchecked emotion. In her case, the emotional devastation caused by Hera's jealousy turned Lamia into a creature consumed by her own anger and grief. In this sense, Lamia represents the dangers of allowing emotions to take control, how they can lead to destruction, and how they can turn us into something unrecognizable, even to ourselves. Her inability to sleep, as well as her inability to find peace, reinforces the idea that unchecked emotional pain can lead to madness and an eventual loss of humanity. And as with many of the monsters in Greek mythology, Lamia's legacy didn't end with her transformation. Over time, she became a figure of terror in the ancient world, a monster who would come to embody the dangers of love, turned dark, and the torment of a grief-stricken soul. In some later myths, Lamia is said to have been tricked into returning to her former beautiful self by the gods, but by then she had already become too consumed by her own anguish to ever truly recover. The myth of Lamia shows us that monsters aren't always born from malice or inherent evil. They can also be born from deep emotional pain. And as tragic as her tale is, it also carries an important message. The power of love, grief, and jealousy can transform us into something unrecognizable. Lamia is a reminder that unchecked emotions, especially the darker ones, can be as dangerous as any physical beast, and that we must learn to control them before they control us. Let's now turn our attention to a lesser-known but fascinating monster from Greek mythology, the Cretan bull. While we've already encountered various beasts connected to the god's wrath, the Cretan bull represents another side of divine interference, one where pride and punishment collide in the form of a creature so wild it becomes uncontrollable. The story of the Cretan bull might seem a little more straightforward than some of the others, but it still carries with it powerful messages about hubris and the consequences of defying the gods. This bull was originally a magnificent creature sent to King Minos of Crete by the god Poseidon as a symbol of divine favor. Poseidon expected Minos to sacrifice the bull in honor of the gods, but Minos, enamored by the bull's beauty, chose to keep it for himself instead. He decided to sacrifice another less impressive bull in its place. This act of defiance of thinking he could outwit a god was something the gods could not allow. Poseidon, furious with Minos for breaking his promise, cursed the bull, making it go wild and ravage the island. What had once been a divine gift turned into a monstrous force, and its rampage left a trail of destruction across Crete. Historians still argue about what the Cretan bull represents in Greek mythology. Is it a symbol of the consequences of defying divine will? Is it a warning about the dangers of hubris, of thinking one can outsmart the gods or act with impunity? Or is the bull a reminder that nature, once disturbed, can become uncontrollable? Whatever the interpretation, the story of the Cretan bull carries a lesson about the consequences of ignoring the natural order and disregarding divine authority. The Cretan bull's wild nature didn't end with Minos. In fact, the bull's story is forever tied to one of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology, Heracles. The Cretan bull was one of the 12 labors assigned to Heracles, and it wasn't an easy task. The bull was powerful, uncontrollable, and dangerous, but Heracles, with his great strength, was tasked with capturing it alive. After a fierce struggle, Heracles was able to subdue the bull, showcasing his immense physical prowess and his ability to overcome nearly impossible odds. But Heracles didn't just capture the bull for the sake of completing his labor. He also carried it back to Eurystheus the king, who had set the labors as proof of his strength and obedience. Once again, the bull's journey from divine favor to wild chaos, and ultimately its capture, underscores the unpredictable and volatile nature of the divine world. The gods may give gifts, but they can just as easily take them away, turning them into punishments when humans step out of line. The Cretan bull's ultimate fate didn't end with its capture. As with many other creatures in Greek mythology, the legacy of the Cretan bull lived on in various ways. In some versions of the myth, the bull's wild nature was said to have passed down to future generations, with other powerful creatures being born from it. But as with many of the great monsters in Greek mythology, the Cretan bull's legacy is a reminder that creatures born of the gods, no matter how beautiful or powerful, are never truly safe from divine wrath. In the end, the Cretan bull is a story of both divine punishment and human triumph. It shows that while humans may be able to defeat powerful creatures and accomplish great feats, they are still subject to the whims of the gods. The bull's wildness, its defiance, and its eventual capture by Heracles all serve as reminders that the gods' power is both a gift and a curse. And as with many other Greek monsters, the true lesson is one of respect respect for the gods, the natural world, and the forces that shape our lives, no matter how powerful or majestic they may seem. Let's dive into one of the most epic battles in Greek mythology, the Titanomachy, the great war between the Olympian gods and the Titans. This was no small skirmish. It was the celestial clash for control over the universe, a battle between the old guard, the Titans, and the new generation, the Olympians, and it resulted in the reshaping of the cosmos as the Greeks knew it. The war between the Olympians led by Zeus and the Titans led by Kronos marked the moment when the order of the gods shifted with the victors, bringing a new era of divine rule. The Titans, who had once ruled the heavens and the earth, were formidable beings who embodied the primal forces of nature, chaos, the earth, the sea, and the sky. Kronos, the leader of the Titans, was the god of time, and he had overthrown his father Uranus to take control of the universe. However, fearing that his own children might one day rise up against him, in the same way Kronos swallowed each of his offspring as they were born. But when Zeus, his youngest son, was born, his mother Rhea saved him by tricking Kronos into swallowing a rock instead. Zeus would eventually grow to challenge his father and set the stage for the Titanomachy. The Olympians were not only led by Zeus, but also by his siblings, Hestia, Hera, Demeter, Poseidon, and Hades. Alongside them stood a number of powerful allies, such as the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, who were freed from their prison by Zeus and helped him forge weapons and bring down the Titans. The war was long and brutal, with the Olympians facing seemingly insurmountable odds. But after a series of decisive battles, the Olympians triumphed, and Zeus struck down Kronos, banishing the Titans to the depths of Tartarus, a hellish pit within the underworld. Historians still debate the significance of the Titanomachy. Some see it as a mythological allegory for the rise of a new order, the transition from the chaotic, untamed forces of nature, represented by the Titans, to the more structured, rational rule of the Olympians. Others argue that it's a reflection of the Greeks' understanding of time, fate, and power, as Kronos' control over time, and his eventual downfall can be interpreted as a metaphor for the inevitability of change, even for the mightiest of beings. The myth of the Titanomachy then becomes a symbol of the ever-changing tides of power, where the established order is overthrown by newer, more powerful forces. The consequences of the Titanomachy were far-reaching. After their victory, the Olympians divided the realms among themselves, with Zeus taking control of the heavens, Poseidon the seas, and Hades the underworld. However, the defeat of the Titans didn't mean the complete end of their influence. Some Titans, like Oceanus and Hyperion, managed to avoid the battle, and their descendants played important roles in later myths. The defeat of the Titans may have brought about the rise of the Olympians, but the old gods' lingering influence remained part of the fabric of Greek mythology. The Titanomachy also serves as a reminder that no matter how powerful a ruler may be, change is inevitable. Even Kronos, the god of time, could not escape the fate that awaited him, just as the rise of the Olympians signified a cosmic shift. So too does the idea that power once thought unshakable can eventually be overthrown. It's a theme that recurs in many mythological tales, the cyclical nature of power, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the eternal struggle between the forces of chaos and order. In the end, the Titanomachy is a battle for supremacy, not just in terms of divine rule, but in the very structure of the universe itself. It represents the endless tension between the old and the new, between chaos and order, and between the inevitable passage of time and the forces that seek to control it. It's a myth that captures the complex nature of power and fate, showing that no matter how mighty or established a force may be, there is always the possibility of change, and that change can come with both great triumph and terrible consequence. Now, let's dive into one of the more tragic and haunting myths in Greek mythology, the tale of Scylla. This myth doesn't just feature a terrifying monster. It also serves as a story of transformation, betrayal, and the consequences of divine intervention. Scylla, once a beautiful sea nymph, was transformed into a hideous creature whose very presence struck terror into the hearts of sailors. Her story is not one of inherent evil, but of suffering and the devastating consequences of the jealousy of the gods. Scylla's transformation began with a godly rivalry. She was originally a beautiful nymph who caught the eye of the sea god Glaucus. However, Scylla did not return his affections, and when he sought the help of the sorceress Circe to win her love, he was rejected once again. In his frustration, Glaucus turned to Circe for help, but when she became infatuated with him herself, he refused her advances. In a fit of jealousy, Circe decided to take matters into her own hands. She brewed a potion and used it to transform Scylla into a terrible monster. The transformation was grotesque. Scylla's lower body became a mass of writhing, savage dog heads, each one capable of snapping and devouring anything that came too close. She became a terrifying sea creature, lurking near the strait between Italy and Sicily, where she would snatch sailors from passing ships, dragging them into the depths of the sea. Her presence was a constant threat to those who had to pass through the dangerous waters. Historians still debate the symbolism of Scylla's transformation. Was she a victim of the gods' cruelty, or was her monstrosity an allegory for the dangers of rejecting divine love and affection? Scylla's story is often seen as one of punishment for her failure to reciprocate Glaucus's love. In a way, her transformation serves as a reflection of the uncontrollable nature of divine wrath. Even the most beautiful and pure creatures could be turned into monsters in the eyes of the gods. But Scylla's myth is also a tragic commentary on the consequences of jealousy and the abuse of power. Circe's jealousy drove her to destroy Scylla, and in doing so, she condemned the nymph to a life of monstrosity. In a way, Scylla became a symbol of how unchecked emotion, whether jealousy or rage, can lead to the destruction of something pure. Her fate was sealed by the gods' whims, and she became an enduring figure of both fear and pity. Interestingly, Scylla's myth is often paired with another famous creature from Greek mythology, Charybdis. Together, they represented a deadly challenge for sailors attempting to navigate the treacherous waters between Italy and Sicily. Scylla, with her many heads and hunger for destruction, and Charybdis with her monstrous whirlpools capable of devouring entire ships, created a perilous choice for any sailor passing through the narrow strait. In the myth of Odysseus, he faces the challenge of passing between these two horrors, ultimately having to choose which monster he would risk encountering. This moment in the Odyssey speaks to the theme of inevitable danger and the difficult choices we must make when confronted with two equally terrifying options. For Odysseus, the decision was clear. He chose to risk encountering Scylla rather than Charybdis, knowing that while he would lose a few men to Scylla, the alternative would have been the destruction of his entire ship. This story speaks to the broader theme of making choices in a world where dangers seem to be everywhere, and where no decision is without its cost. Ultimately, Scylla's myth is one of transformation and tragedy. She was not born a monster, but became one due to the malicious intervention of a jealous goddess. Her story is a reminder of how divine jealousy and human emotions can shape the destinies of mortals and immortals alike, leading to tragic consequences. Scylla's fate reflects the ancient Greek belief that the gods controlled not only the natural world, but the very lives of those who lived within it. Even a beautiful nymph, once admired for her grace, could be turned into a terrifying beast at the whim of the gods, and her monstrous form would serve as a warning to those who dared challenge the will of divine power. Let's shift our focus to another creature, born from the earth's depths, one that gave birth to some of the most feared monsters in Greek mythology, Echidna. Often referred to as the mother of monsters, Echidna was a fearsome hybrid creature, with the upper body of a beautiful woman and the lower body of a serpent. Born of the ancient gods Gaia and Tartarus, she inhabited a cave where she lived among her monstrous offspring, many of whom went on to become infamous in Greek myth. Her legacy is a complicated one, part monster, part matriarch, and a key figure in the world of terrifying beasts. Echidna's existence isn't just about her appearance. It's about the deep connection she shares with the creatures of chaos and destruction in Greek mythology. She and her partner, Typhon, yes, the storm giant we talked about earlier, were responsible for bringing forth some of the most famous monsters that heroes would later have to face. These included the likes of Cerberus, the Hydra, the Chimera, and the Nemean lion beasts so powerful and dangerous that defeating them would become rites of passage for legendary heroes like Heracles and Theseus. Historians still debate the role of Echidna in Greek mythology. Was she a symbol of the chaotic forces of nature, forever spawning terrifying creatures to keep the balance between order and disorder? Or was she a mother figure not of nurturing, but of creation, an embodiment of the primal urge to produce monsters from the depths of the earth? Her role in mythology seems to straddle these two concepts, as she is both feared and revered for her monstrous progeny. However, unlike many of the other creatures we've discussed, Echidna's monstrosity wasn't purely the result of divine punishment or vengeance. She was both a creature of nature and a divine force of chaos, suggesting that sometimes the boundaries between good and evil in Greek mythology are not as clear-cut as they might seem. The creatures born of Echidna and Typhon were often linked to the natural world's most unpredictable and dangerous aspects. Take, for instance, Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of the underworld. Cerberus represents the power of death, and as a creature of the underworld, he was a reminder of the inevitability of death and the cyclical nature of life. The Hydra, another of Echidna's offspring, represented the danger of regenerating chaos, with heads that would multiply every time they were cut off. In many ways, the monsters born of Echidna were more than just beasts to be slain. They were symbols of the forces of nature that the ancient Greeks both feared and sought to control. Interestingly, Echidna's offspring were often depicted as more than just mindless killers. They had depth, complexity, and symbolism. The Chimera, for example, represented the dangers of mixed forces combining the heads of a lion, a goat, and a serpent into a creature that could breathe fire. In a sense, it was a metaphor for the human tendency to mix various elements of nature and society together, often leading to chaos and destruction. These creatures were not just evil monsters, but embodiments of the forces that humans could not fully understand or control. Despite her fearsome reputation, Echidna's role in mythology also raises questions about the nature of maternal influence. She gave birth to some of the most feared monsters yet. She was not portrayed as purely evil. Her ability to create life, albeit monstrous life, gives her an unusual position in the world of Greek mythology. While many creatures in these myths are destroyed or defeated by heroes, Echidna's legacy remains entrenched in the narrative of creation and destruction. Her offspring, though often defeated, continue to live on in myth, highlighting how certain forces, particularly the chaotic ones, are ever present, no matter how many times they are vanquished. Her relationship with Typhon, the storm giant, is another key element of her story. Typhon, one of the most powerful monsters in Greek mythology, was a creature of pure destruction. His connection with Echidna creates an image of two primal, uncontrollable forces joining together. This partnership represents the bond between the Earth's fury, represented by Typhon, and the chaos of creation, represented by Echidna. Together, they are a force of nature that even the gods cannot entirely control. The myth of Echidna thus serves as a reminder that monsters in Greek mythology are not always born from malice or punishment. Sometimes they are created from the most fundamental and untamable forces of nature, and they can even be seen as a reflection of the uncontrollable aspects of existence, whether it's death chaos or the destructive power of the natural world. Echidna's legacy reminds us that monsters are not always villains. They are also symbols of the world's wild, untamed forces. Now, let's shift our focus to another creature whose myth centers around transformation, punishment, and the consequences of vanity. Arachne. Her story is one of artistic skill, hubris, and divine retribution, one of the few myths that emphasize the harsh consequences of arrogance, especially when it comes to challenging the gods. Arachne was a mortal woman who was famed throughout Greece for her incredible weaving skills. Her tapestries were so finely crafted and her artistry so breathtaking that even the gods would have admired her work. In particular, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and craft, was revered as the patron of weaving, and her talents in this domain were considered unrivaled. But Arachne, full of youthful pride and confidence, boasted that she was a better weaver than even the goddess herself. This bold challenge was considered an act of arrogance, one that could not go unpunished by the gods. In response to Arachne's challenge, Athena, in her typical fashion, appeared before her in disguise. The goddess offered Arachne a challenge. The two would compete in a weaving contest, and the loser would suffer the consequences. Confident in her abilities, Arachne accepted, and the two set to work, each weaving a tapestry of unparalleled skill. Athena's tapestry depicted the gods in all their glory, showing their power, wisdom, and beauty. Arachne, on the other hand, wove a depiction of the gods' flaws and misdeeds, showing them as vain, vengeful, and cruel. Her tapestry was filled with scenes of divine folly, such as Zeus's many romantic entanglements and the gods' numerous quarrels with mortals. When the tapestries were completed, Athena was enraged not just by the skill of Arachne's weaving, but by the audacity of her portrayal of the gods. Athena, furious with Arachne's arrogance and disrespect, punished her severely. She transformed Arachne into a spider, condemning her to weave for all eternity. In this new form, Arachne would forever be bound to her art, unable to escape the consequences of her vanity. Historians still debate the deeper significance of Arachne's myth. Some interpret it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, The idea that pride and arrogance will always lead to downfall, especially when one challenges the gods. Arachne's punishment, her transformation into a spider, was a symbolic way of forcing her to continue her craft, but now in a diminished and endless form. She was no longer a mortal woman celebrated for her talents. She was now a creature doomed to weave without rest, forever imprisoned in the form of her art. Others argue that Arachne's transformation can also be viewed as a metaphor for the tension between mortals and the divine. Arachne's challenge to the gods represented a desire to transcend the limitations of human existence, to achieve something greater, something immortal. However, in doing so, she was punished, and her dreams of greatness were dashed. But there's also a more nuanced interpretation of Arachne's myth. By weaving a tapestry that depicted the gods' flaws, Arachne may have been engaging in a form of rebellion against divine authority, not just by challenging their superiority, but by questioning their morality. It's as if she was daring the gods to confront their imperfections and hypocrisy. While Arachne's actions were undeniably bold and arrogant, they also reflect a very human desire to challenge the structures of power and authority. In the end, Arachne's fate serves as both a warning and a reflection of the complexities of Greek mythology. Her skill was unmatched, and she was admired by many, but her pride led her to challenge the divine order in a way that was unforgivable to the gods. Her transformation into a spider, a creature that in many ways embodies both artistry and the relentless passage of time, reminds us that talent and ambition are no guarantees of success in a world governed by the whims of the gods. It also suggests that sometimes those who seek to challenge the status quo may find themselves trapped in the very thing they sought to transcend. Arachne's legacy, then, is not just about the consequences of arrogance. It's about the role of art, beauty, and defiance in Greek mythology. As a spider, Arachne continues to weave her webs, eternally crafting beauty out of the very fabric of her punishment. Her tale is a reminder of the fragile line between greatness and destruction, and how the pursuit of art in its purest form can both elevate and entrap. As we near the end of our journey through the monsters of Greek mythology, let's reflect on one of the most enduring themes that run throughout these stories: the fading of monsters and the evolution of the mythological world. By now, we've explored the terrifying creatures born of divine anger, hubris, and chaos. These beings were once formidable forces, representing the raw, untamable aspects of nature and humanity. But as the mythological world shifted, as the Olympian gods solidified their rule, the prevalence of these beasts began to diminish. The mighty titans were overthrown, and the great monsters, once the central figures in the myths, began to fade into the background of legend. This transformation speaks to the broader themes of change and progress in Greek mythology. The rise of the Olympians marked not only a new divine order, but also a new era, where the monsters, once so central to the stories of heroes and gods, slowly became relics of the past. The heroes who once fought and defeated these beasts, Heracles, Theseus, Perseus, were now revered not just for their strength, but for their ability to navigate a world that was gradually becoming more ordered, more civilized. The monsters were no longer the uncontrollable forces they had once been, but rather symbols of an ancient, chaotic world that had been tamed by the gods. However, even as the monsters faded from prominence in the stories of the gods, their legacy remained. They continued to live on in the legends and the lessons they imparted, and in the imagery they left behind. The stories of Medusa, the Hydra, the Minotaur, and others served as powerful reminders of the dangers that could arise from divine wrath, pride, or hubris. These tales weren't just about the battles between gods and monsters. They were about the human condition, about the struggles between order and chaos, about how we confront our own inner demons and the forces that seem beyond our control. Historians often point out that the gradual decline of these monsters in myth could symbolize the shift from a world dominated by primal chaos to one shaped by more rational, human-centered values. The Olympian gods, with their more organized hierarchy, represented a move away from the unpredictable, destructive nature of the Titans and the chaotic monsters they spawned. As the gods of Olympus became more entrenched in the lives of mortals, the monsters that once embodied nature's wrath were seen less as physical threats and more as symbols of past fears, legends that reflected the dark and untamed forces of the world that the Greeks had to reconcile with. Yet the monsters were never entirely forgotten. They continue to surface in modern interpretations of Greek mythology, in art, literature, and film, where they are reimagined in new ways. The monsters of old have taken on new forms, becoming metaphors for the personal and societal struggles we face today. Medusa, with her terrifying gaze, has become a symbol of women's power, while the Minotaur is often interpreted as a representation of the labyrinthine struggles we all face within ourselves. The legacy of these creatures endures not just in their mythological forms, but in how they are woven into the fabric of modern storytelling. As the monsters of Greek mythology gradually faded from the forefront of the mythological world, they gave way to a new era. One where heroes, gods, and mortals navigated a more structured, if still challenging, world. But the lessons of these creatures, the warnings they carried about the dangers of hubris, the wildness of nature, and the complexities of human emotion, are timeless. The creatures we've encountered in these stories may have been defeated or banished, but their lessons remain embedded in the culture and stories that continue to shape us. In closing, the fading of monsters in Greek mythology marks not just the end of an era, but the beginning of a new understanding of the world. A world where human agency and divine will intersect, where the uncontrollable forces of nature are not vanquished but understood. The monsters may have disappeared from the myths, but the truths they represented continue to echo throughout history, reminding us of the fragile balance between chaos and order, between the human and the divine.